My guest at this time is Dr. Tom Connor. He's the William P. Harris Professor of Military History at Hillsdale College in Michigan. He's also the author of the brand new book, War and Remembrance, The Story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. It's published by the University of Kentucky Press. In full disclosure, I'm a Hillsdale grad and took 7 courses with Dr. Connor, including a summer session visiting World War I and World War II battlefields and cemeteries, and that's a major focus of what the book is about. Today we want to get Dr. Connor's thoughts on Sunday's 100th anniversary of the Armistice that ended World War I, and learn why we all ought to know more about the American Battle Monuments Commission. And Doc, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be on again with you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with the end of World War I. Again, we're commemorating 100 years this Sunday. It's a war a lot of Americans don't know very much about. They obviously know it happened because we had a World War II, but other than that, sometimes the details get fuzzy. But it's really a war that still has tentacles that affect us today. But let's start here. How would you explain the relief on November 11th, 1918, when the guns finally went silent after more than 4 years of killing?
Well, Greg, there was a huge sense of relief all around the Western world, I dare say. Of course, in Germany, the sentiment was a little bit different because they knew they'd lost, and the other Central Powers as well. But I'm sure many of your listeners have seen perhaps footage or at least seen photographs of the crowds dancing in the streets in the major American cities and in London and in Paris, whatnot. So there was a great air of celebration when the fighting stopped, a great air of relief. Of course, the soldiers who were still alive were happy to be alive. One of the most poignant things about the story of the Armistice, I mean, the fighting ended by the stroke of a pen at 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918, but the guns were firing right up to the last seconds, and guys were still being killed, and really for no purpose whatsoever. But it's there was tragedy that just preceded the actual cessation of the fighting.
Let's talk about the cost of World War I. I know from your class that in France it's known as the lost generation. If you study it, the trench warfare, the mustard gas, some of the ugliest fighting, and not much ground gained as a result of all the slaughter. So how would you characterize the cost of the war?
It was extremely costly, needless to say. There were about 10 million combat deaths worldwide. That's all participants. The United States lost a little over 100,000 dead. So measured against the losses of the countries on whose side we fought, but which had been in the war a lot longer than we had, like the British and like the French, even the Italians, and of course the Russians, before they fell out of the war, they were fighting on the same side that we ultimately joined. So 100,000 dead versus 1.3 million dead in the French case, an even million dead from the forces of the British Empire, probably 2 to 3 million dead on the Russian side, 500,000 to 600,000 dead on the Italian side. I mean, our losses, 100,000 dead is a lot of bloodshed, but our losses compared with our fighting partners were on the lower end of the scale, but still, it was a shock to Americans. The bloodiest battle in American history is the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which was the last battle of the First World War for us. We lost 26,000 dead in the 47 days of that battle. So the losses were quite significant, though, of course, in the Second World War, they would be far greater still.
Doc, let's also look at what happened after World War I. A lot of folks would say that the seeds for World War II, for example, were sown in the peace that followed World War I, or at least the terms of that peace, and even a lot of the redrawing of the maps in Europe and beyond have had significant impact since then. So what do you see as the impact of the war and its aftermath on us even right now?
The interesting thing about the two world wars, when we consider them both sort of side by side, is the Second World War was a far bloodier conflict for us and for all the other participants, and particularly the civilian populations in Europe and Asia. we still don't have a definitive count of the dead from the Second World War, and probably never will. I'm not sure we really do from the First World War either. The First World War, I think, did have a far greater impact in shaping the 20th century than even the Second World War did, because we are very much living in the shadow of the First World War still, particularly with the territorial adjustments that were made in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. There were a lot of new countries created in the aftermath of the First World War, which really aren't countries in the truest sense. I mean, their populations are divided on religious grounds, even cultural grounds. Places like Iraq, for example, we've learned the hard way from our own involvement in Iraq, for example, just how complex that territorial domain that was called Iraq from about 1920 in the wake of World War I actually is. So, and then you've got this belief on the part of many historians that the Second World War sprang directly from seeds sown in the First World War, and then the inconclusive nature of the First World War. Germany was beaten but wasn't prepared to accept that as reality, so then you get the Hitler movement in the 1920s and the 30s, which ultimately brings him to power and then brings the Second World War. So I think that's one of the reasons why Americans, for example, are more interested in remembering the Second World War than the First World War, because we're still trying to figure out what, if anything, our participation gained for us in the First World War. So Second World War is a little easier to see. At least the enemies we defeated in World War II stayed defeated.
We're talking with Dr. Tom Connor, professor of military history at Hillsdale College. The new book is War and Remembrance, the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. And speaking of which, something else that came out of World War I is the American Battle Monuments Commission. It was really our first overseas war, which means it was our first overseas war dead. So explain why the American Battle Monuments Commission was created.
Well, it was indeed created for that purpose, Greg. We, again, lost over 100,000 dead in that war, and once it was over, then the question of, well, where were the bodies of the dead soldiers going to be permanently buried? And it wasn't exactly our first overseas war, because the Spanish-American War, of course, had been an overseas war, but in terms of scale, we had about 7,000 dead out of the Spanish-American War, so it was possible to bring all those bodies home from such places as the Philippines or Cuba. But World War I, it's quite a bit more complicated if you're talking about repatriating 70, 80, 90,000 bodies. So families were given the choice by the War Department at the end of World War I whether their dead loved ones would remain in a permanent cemetery overseas or be brought home. The majority were brought home, but those whom the families consented to have buried abroad then were placed in permanent cemeteries, and that meant an agency of the government needed to be created to design, build, and ultimately maintain not just the cemeteries. There were 8 World War I cemeteries that the ABMC set up after World War I, 14 more at the end of World War II, but there were also 11 monuments built at the end of World War I, and most all of these monument and cemetery sites are right on the battlefields, and of course that's where the Remembrance comes in the title of my book. War necessitated the creation of the American Battle Monuments Commission, but the purpose and the ongoing mission of that agency is to foster remembrance of the dead.
For those who haven't been at one of these American sites on otherwise foreign soil, how do you feel when you're there and contemplating the sacrifices our people have made at various times in history?
Well, there's always something of a mix of emotions, Greg. I'm sure you can identify with this, having been to a number of the sites yourself. It's a mix of pride and kind of exhilaration. I tell my students I always get a thrill just being at a place overseas where the American flag is flying.
So the American flag is flying at these places, and Americans take care of them, but Is it technically American soil or not?
The cemeteries and the monument sites are not American soil.
They're not.
They are on soil that has been given to us, given to the United States for the purpose of maintaining overseas memorials. But were those sites actually American soil, then we would be running the risk of getting tied up with asylum seekers and that kind of thing. So the cemeteries they don't exactly have the same status as, say, an embassy or a consular post would. But still, one of the writers at the end of World War I, he was British. The British have, of course, hundreds of war cemeteries beyond their own shores. But he described the cemeteries as little bits of the home country in the territory of other people. And that's, I think, one way of viewing what our cemeteries are. They are outposts of remembrance. They're manned and administered, of course, by an American agency. They contain American war dead, and they certainly are meant to remind our own people back here, but also the host nationals and visitors who come from all over the world, how willing Americans have been to make whatever sacrifices were necessary on the soil of other countries to defend freedom.
Let's go back to the wake of World War I here and the creation of the ABMC. Was this something that was widely supported and pretty non-controversial, or did some controversy erupt when this idea was brought up?
Yes, to both your propositions here. It was widely supported. The statute that was enacted by Congress in early March of 1923 and created the ABMC passed both houses unanimously. But the controversies were about the nature of the authority that the ABMC would have. A lot of veterans groups, a lot of military units in the immediate aftermath of the war, that is to say, before the soldiers actually went home after the fighting was over, a lot of the units put up memorials of their own making. They just picked a piece of ground and put up a memorial. They didn't necessarily get permission from the owner of the ground to do that. They didn't necessarily have enough money to create a memorial that was going to last very long. But and over time, some of those private memorials proved an embarrassment for the United States because there just there weren't enough resources to maintain them in a presentable way. So the ABMC had to stop a lot of private organizations from putting memorials up for just that reason, if they determined that enough resources wouldn't be there to preserve them properly. There was also something of a controversy about where the dead should be buried. It was a rather unseemly argument that broke out, but in a very public way in the media in the early 1920s, one side trying to persuade the families to bring their dead loved ones home, another side of this particular argument trying to persuade them to leave them abroad. So, yes, I think just about anything that happened in the aftermath of World War I had some sort of controversy attached to it.
You mentioned the maintenance. The meticulous maintenance of these sites is perhaps one of the things that really sticks in the mind most. Obviously, the observance and the recognition of the sacrifice made is the most powerful thing, but the care with which these sites are maintained is truly impressive.
Yes, Greg, and as you can well imagine, that's not by accident. The government strives with all its energies and efforts to keep the sites beautiful, because that's the government's ongoing way, and on behalf of the American people, our ongoing way of honoring the soldiers who are buried in the sites and the memorials, the monuments that are meant to commemorate their sacrifices, just simply by keeping the sites as beautiful as possible. And the locals, the host nationals, the people of France, the people of the Netherlands, Belgium, England, all the countries overseas, there are 11 total that host these monuments. I think our efforts to maintain them in their pristinely beautiful character is a way of making a statement, an ongoing statement about how much we value the sacrifices made in the defense of freedom today and for always.
Well, you may have just answered both of my last two questions with that, but why was writing this book so important to you?
Well, I wanted to tell that story because it's been the great privilege and opportunity of my life to have been able to visit most all of the overseas sites during the last 40 years and to have done so often in the company of student groups. And over the course of those visits, I've gotten a chance to know many of the personnel who are responsible for maintaining the sites and see how dedicated they are, see how forthcoming they are, see how committed to the endeavor of preserving these places of memory are with the people entrusted with that job. And I've also become aware that very few Americans even know of the existence of these places. They may know because presidents go there so frequently. They may know about the Normandy Cemetery, the World War II cemetery above Omaha Beach, but they have no idea that there are more than 20 sites from the two world wars, not just like it. Each one of the cemeteries is unique, but other cemeteries abroad. Altogether, there are roughly 125,000 Americans resting permanently in 22 different cemeteries, dead from the First World War and the Second World War. 125,000. That's roughly 40% of the total dead from those two conflicts together. 100,000 in the First World War, 400,000 in the Second World War. And it's a shame that more Americans don't know about these sites, but I'm hoping the book will at least make something of a dent in people's awareness and get the story out there, because it's a beautiful story, and it's a story that all Americans can be proud of.
It's an incredible book. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of War and Remembrance, the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. It will help you build an even greater appreciation for those who gave the ultimate devotion for our country. And on this particular weekend, those who are still with us who have served our country are great veterans. So, Doc, thank you so much for putting this together, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Greg. Again, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and pleasure to salute all the living veterans as well as those who have gone before. Thank you.
Dr. Tom Connor, William P. Harris Professor of Military History at Hillsdale College. Again, the brand new book, War and Remembrance, the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.